Welcome to Module 6 of the Horse Council of British Columbia Emergency Preparedness Training Series. In this module, we are going to discuss identification and ownership. Proper and effective identification of each animal is critical to biosecurity, animal health, ownership, and inventory. Traceability, including distinct and accurate animal identification, premise identification, and movement records, are fundamental to disease response and emergency preparedness protocols. We will begin with risk identification. Possible risk to animals not properly identified or failure to provide proof of ownership include the theft of the animals, inability to confirm the ownership of the animals, animals abandoned at evacuation sites, and animals at large. These risks can be mitigated by making sure that all animals have some form of identification on or with them when they are picked up for evacuation or delivered to the evacuation site. All evacuation forms must be completed for each animal or herd. Only animals with proof of ownership are released from evacuation facilities. The owners must approve movement of their animals to another location, and the owner must sign a release form before animals are released or moved. The most common methods of permanent identification for horses include microchips, hot iron brands, freeze brands, lip tattoos, registration papers, and photos. The photos need to be of both sides of the horse and from the front and the back. Temporary identification for horses may include paint brands, tags on their halters, descriptive markings, or spray paint. The photos to the side show some examples of temporary ID. And if animals are found deceased, photographs should be taken of the animal along with any forms of identification and the location where they were found. Effective animal identification requires proper preparation ahead of time. In preparation for your emergency event, you will need to make sure that all the volunteers are aware of the necessary forms for identification during the evacuation of horses and how to complete them. You will need to predetermine what means of temporary ID you will be using for animals who arrive with no permanent ID. Estimate how many horses will require temporary identification so you are able to secure the necessary supplies. And you will want to message out ahead of time to local horse owners the importance of identification and proof of ownership and possible options for temporary ID. Supplies that you may require for temporary identification or proof of ownership include an RFID scanner, so you are able to scan for microchips. In horses, microchips are most often found in the neck, but they can also be in the lip. Markers or non-toxic spray paint. Your local farm supply store should have livestock paint available in multiple colors. A livestock marking crayon, also available at farm stores in a variety of colors. Ear or luggage tags, which can be braided into the mane or attached to the halter of the horse. a camera. Even though we all have camera phones, it is best to have a Polaroid camera or similar so photos can be attached to paperwork immediately. And all the necessary paperwork will need to be developed ahead of time. This should include evacuation sheets, identification sheets, and movement records. This section is going to cover how to implement your identification and proof of ownership program. At loading, the transporter will need to have the evacuation forms ready for completion when the animals are picked up. Each horse or each owner or farm will need to have their own evacuation identification sheet. The owner may be available to assist with the completion of the paperwork, or the transporter may need to do it on their own. Make sure you fill out the forms with as much information as possible. All horses need to be identified and ownership indicated before the horses are transported. Here is an example of an identification form that you can use. For identification and proof of ownership during receiving at the evacuation sites, you will want to set up a check-in station for receiving all animals. All animals will be processed through this area before they are moved into temporary housing. You will need to have all necessary paperwork and forms available for check-in and identification. You will need to verify that the evacuation or receiving papers are complete, including that the identification on the forms match the horse or horses. If the horse has no visible means of identification, you will need to provide temporary ID. As discussed previously, this can be a tag in the mane or a number painted on the horse. Take photographs of horses as necessary to go with the paperwork, especially ones that are brought in as strays or abandoned. Remember that some horses may be microchipped and can be scanned. Microchip numbers should be recorded on the evacuation or receiving forms. Owners should be provided a copy of the paperwork, even if they just take a photo of the records for their records. They will be able to use this as proof of ownership when they pick up their animals. And make sure you keep all records accessible and copies even after the event is over, in case you need them. When it comes time to release animals, proof of ownership will be required. Do not release animals to individuals without proof of ownership or contracted custody. Proof of ownership may include copies or photos of the initial check-in paperwork, registration papers, photos of the animals, or proof of address where the animals were picked up. Animals cannot be transported to another site without permission of the owner. Owners must confirm through a signature that they have picked up their animals from the evacuation site. And in the unfortunate event that an animal dies, photographs should be taken of the animal along with any forms of identification and the location where they were found. And now we will wrap up Module 6 with a quick review of the key points. All animals must have some form of identification on or with them. Temporary identification for horses may include paint brands, tags on halters, descriptive markings, or tags braided into their manes. You can only release animals to their owners with proof of ownership. Take photographs of animals as necessary to go with the paperwork, especially animals that are brought in as strays or abandoned. And take photos of all deceased animals for future identification. You have now reached the end of Module 6 and can proceed to Module 7 on animal health.